For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010, we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer.
Father God, we want to thank you so much for this opportunity to have a show where somebody's exposing the truth of really what's happening in this country. Lord, bless Mr. Happel, bless the show and the guests on the show, and we pray this in your son's name. Amen. Mr. Happel, I yield the floor.
Well, thank you, Kelby. Tonight's program promises to be a terrific program. Our guests tonight are Mary Fanning and Alan Jones, and our program is about I guess I have to call it illegal transfer, because it really wasn't done through the legitimate means, but the illegal transfer of our port management at some of our ports to the enemies of our country. This is treason at the highest levels of government, and it's something that needs to be brought to the American public, and tonight we are going to attempt to do exactly that. Before I start really the program and turn it over to our guests, my friends Mary and Richard in Bozeman sent me a quote that they suggested would be a good quote to start the program, and after reading it I have to agree. This is a quote by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover in 1956. Quote, "The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he can't believe it exists. The American mind simply has not come to a realization of the evil which has been introduced into our midst. It rejects even the assumption that human creatures could espouse a philosophy which must ultimately destroy all that is good and decent," unquote. Great way to start this program. Mary and Alan, I want to thank you for having the courage and conviction to disclose to the American people the level of deceit and outright treason that occurred during the Obama administration, and how we must expose and correct the problems that created that during the past 8 years. I also want our listeners to click on the Betrayal Papers archive on our website to read the 6-part series that you both exhaustively researched, as well as a number of other people, and prepared for the Center for Security Policy. You folks are truly American heroes, and I really appreciate you being willing to be on our show. Mary and Alan, I guess I'll start with you, Mary. Would you give a little bit of information on your background, and then we'll give Alan an opportunity to do the same.
I'm an American citizen who really did not want to give up her country. I was brought up in a family that, from a very young age, we were taught to love our country. We sang the songs that our father taught us, and we marched through our house singing them. As a result, when I heard that there was a group of journalists who were putting out untruths for Barack Obama and that they were working in concert, I decided that the thing to do was to create a coalition of journalists and analysts and researchers, and that we would reverse engineer what the journalists had done, and we would bring the truth to the American people. I spoke to General Vallely, and he backed us, and we started with the betrayal papers. That was actually our second project. The first we did was Gutter Awareness to Stop Gutter Now. And that's because the Muslim Brotherhood is headquartered in Qatar, or Gutter. And we exposed all the universities and the corporations that were working with Qatar. Then we moved to betrayal papers, and then Alan and I, we moved on to Port Canaveral. As they were handing over Port Canaveral, we began at least 15-month investigation, Alan. And as we dug into Port Canaveral, we discovered that not only had they handed over an illegal lease to Gulftainer, as we started digging into it, we found that it was Saddam Hussein's nuclear mastermind and his family that they had given the 35-year lease to. And so we wrote papers at our websites, the American Report, and also 1776 channel. And then Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney and Claire Lopez came to us and asked us to write another expose. And so we wrote What Could Possibly Go Wrong for Them, which is a shorter version of the long version that we wrote. The long paper investigation is about 105 pages, and then we wrote a shorter version.
Okay, good. And I can say that your documentation is impeccable, that you've done a terrific job of footnoting and providing background information on everything that you've done. And that is certainly adds to the credibility of the information that you turned over. Alan, possibly would you give us a little bit of information about your background and how you came into this process as well?
Sure. And thank you for having us on the program tonight. So I don't actually come from a journalism background. I have had opportunities to live abroad and travel a lot. I've been to Europe and Asia and some parts of the Middle East and North Africa. And really that kind of travel gives you an appreciation of the unique gem that we have living in the United States of America under the U.S. Constitution. And that if we lose this, it is the shining beacon on the hill. It's we lose this, the whole world loses. And I became more appreciative of that, and accidentally got into journalism when I went online to learn more about Lieutenant Colonel Terry Lakin, who actually bravely asked to see Barack Obama's credentials before deploying to Afghanistan and was then court-martialed. They threw the book at him. And I went on Wikipedia and found that there was no Wikipedia article, so I decided to write one myself and saw it scrubbed off of Wikipedia within 45 minutes. And it was like a cold breeze blew into the air. that cold breeze of tyranny. And I knew that this was not a free country and that something needed to be done to try to restore that. I didn't know what to do, but someone from Terry Lakin's camp eventually suggested that I contact the Washington Times Communities. They recommended me. They made the introduction. That led to me writing about 25 articles. They're all on a variety of national security topics, including Barack Obama's Selective Service records, which I believe are fraudulent, that there was a cover-up at Selective Service, and eventually covered the Gulftainer story with Mary, and it was about probably 15 months of investigation, tremendous amount of research, open source, also requests for Sunshine Law documents, which are like a FOIA for Florida, and we presented our evidence. It was a labor of love, and hopefully this is a step in the right direction in protecting the American people.
Well, I think it certainly is, and tonight I'd like to really give this the review that it deserves, and hopefully with the millions of listeners that we have on this program now, thanks to Southern Broadcasting and some affiliates that we've brought into the program, we can give this information to the number of people that it really deserves to reach. I'd like to start this with asking you to please give an overview of your findings about the influence of Islam over Barack Obama, and by that I mean his true family background, religious convictions and training, and how Barack Obama was, I guess, brought into the presidency with a much different background than most people realize.
Well, I'd like to just start saying about Barack Obama, which, by the way, he has several aliases he's used. To quote Rumsfeld, there's the known knowns, there's the known unknowns, and then there are the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know that we don't know. So he's a very mysterious person. I really don't even know where to start or where to end.
Well, let's start with the real family background, and we'll try to do this in a fairly short manner. But Mary, you've done some research on Obama, and I'd like to just maybe make a connection to his religious convictions, his background as he grew up, and how you see this playing into the introduction of a lot of Islamic influence in the White House.
Well, he grew up in Indonesia, and supposedly in a CIA family. We believe he's an Islamo-Marxist. He has an awful lot of Muslim Brotherhood connections if one looks at all the people that he brought into his own administration. If one looks at who he connected with on the world stage, particularly Mr. President now, Erdogan of Turkey, was the first person that he called upon being elected. The first world leader was Recep Erdogan. And beyond that, when we went back and started looking at his associations, because while we have aliases and a social security number belonging to Henry Brownell that was, and documents being mailed under that name to a Chicago address, so many of those are fraudulent that the best way to understand Barack Obama is strictly by his associations. So when we see that his mentor was Frank Marshall Davis, and there's a piece on our site, the Clues piece that's referred to, and it's the clues to Barack Obama's mysterious ID. And his associations connect to people like Bill Ayers, who's a communist revolutionary, or to people who are connected to the Silver Masters, who were Soviet agents that had come into the country in order to create a Soviet America. So as we connected him to different people through his campaign or people that worked for him or just the guy in his neighborhood, it became clear that not only was he not the guy who was going to take red America and blue America and make purple America, but it became clear that, in fact, he was a racist. And when people asked him about basic American questions, instead of referring to the 50 states, he referred to the 57, which, of course, there's 57 Muslim nations. And so there were a few places where he tripped up. One of the most important places, and really the only time that anyone's ever caught him on live tape where he made a mistake and he didn't know anyone was listening, is when he was speaking to Mr. Medvedev from Russia. And he was caught on a live mic. And he told that Mr. Medvedev that when he was reelected, he would have more flexibility to do the things that he wanted to do and to get back to Vlad and give him these messages. And so that was the first time that people heard him without him knowing. And it's perhaps the only time we've heard him in that context. Mm-hmm. So when we hear about his flexibility, and particularly when we hear about the things that have been thrown at Donald J. Trump right now, saying that he's all about Russia, it's important to remember his flexibility remark, but also it's important to remember the Uranium One deal, where Hillary, which Barack Obama had to sign off on, gave 20% of U.S. uranium to the Russians, who then gave that uranium to the Iranians. It's also important to remember that under Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, we have Silicon Valley, where our high tech resides, right? Mm-hmm. And they built Skokolov. Skokolov is outside of Moscow, and it's a new Silicon Valley in Russia. Not a lot of people understand how much has been transferred in technology to Russia.
So we actually developed a whole map of his connections, spanning everywhere from his staff inside the White House, for example, Valerie Jarrett, to the director of the health department in Hawaii, who released his long-form birth certificate and then reportedly perished in a small plane crash, the only person who died aboard. But if you look at these connections and trace them back historically, going back into the 80s, into the 70s, into the 60s, into the 1950s, even the 1940s, and you trace these family connections and intelligence connections, the picture that we came away with, and remember, we let the investigation lead us. We don't lead the investigation, to quote Mike Zullo. But what we discovered was a network that consistently goes back to Soviet intelligence and Cuban intelligence, operatives of the Silver Master and Golos spy rings that were the target of House Un-American Activities Committee hearings. We trove through lots of FBI documents that have been released under FOIA and discovered that their connections through his mentor, Frank Marshall Davis, through a couple in Chicago called the Margolins, who were associates of Loretta Fuddy in Hawaii, that Mr. Margolin's parents' names turn up in FBI documents on wiretaps that exposed their concerns that they were being listened to and watched, and their connections, to this network. So you realize that the Soviet penetration is a long-term project that's been going on for decades, and that this people chart has Barack Obama right in the middle of it. So it raises a lot of questions about his allegiance.
Yeah,
well,
in fact,
I'm sorry. That is a good lead in too, and I guess I wanted to ask you both to tell our listeners about the changes in cabinet-level agencies that have happened over the past 8 years and the level of Islamic influence over the daily affairs of America. And please name names and show how thoroughly these people have intertwined themselves into the American political structure.
Well, for starters, there are many members of the Muslim Brotherhood that have moved into our agencies, and not only that, our FBI, our CIA, all the documentation on the Muslim Brotherhood has been purged. Now, it was purged because they said that you can't single out any particular ethnicity or religion, and so as the communists always said, use our Constitution against us, and they've done that in a very thorough manner. As we started going through the FBI vault, and I'm not sure if your listeners are aware of the FBI vault, but it has documentation on every FBI investigation over many, many, many years. In fact, we were so successful with it that they got rid of the search engine, the search term, so you can no longer use one word. So rather than going into a document that's a couple hundred pages and putting the one word that you're looking for, now you need to go through every page looking for that word, right?
Part of the search capabilities were disabled after we did our investigation.
They blunted it. So I'm assuming, and I certainly hope that President Trump reinstitutes that in the FBI vault. But as we came through that, and it's not just the Muslim Brotherhood, it's also people like Valerie Jarrett. Now, Valerie Jarrett's father, her mother, her father-in-law, her grandfather were all partners and worked with Alfred Stern. Alfred Stern was a Soviet spy. He was an American who was a Soviet spy. And in fact, when they went to arrest him, her father, Valerie Jarrett's father, Dr. Bowman, left the country, and he went to Iran. Dr. Bowman was a geneticist. He's since passed away. Now, of course, they presented a full story that racist America, he had to go and work someplace else. But I'm not sure that was true, particularly at that time. He was working for the Army, and he came directly out of the Army and went to Iran. And so when we were going through the FBI vault, along with people like Cliff Kincaid and Roger Aronoff at Accuracy and Media, they came across the FBI files that every one of these were, should anything happen in the country, they were to be arrested. They didn't just have a file that said these people are iffy. They said that these were the top danger to the country, so that if anything should happen, these people must be arrested immediately, including Frank Marshall Davis.
It's called the FBI Security Index.
Correct.
Great. Mm-hmm.
So then, it's helpful to make timelines, because as we track Frank Marshall Davis when he moves to Hawaii, and he starts bringing the longshoremen, and that was, of course, to try to take down Hawaii for the communists. There's a pretty heavy presence of communists in Hawaii. Governor Abercrombie was a communist, or is a communist.
It would have established basically a Cuba in the Pacific that the Soviets then could have used for air bases and other military strategic reasons.
Wow, that's amazing. Could you, can you kind of, would you give us a thorough vetting of the people that now, well, not now, but under the Obama administration, I'm sure some of them are still holdovers, were deeply entrenched in cabinet-level agencies and how they impacted the daily affairs of America?
Well, they're through every agency. In fact, the newest discovery has just been in Congress. And I'm not sure if you've read the story that 3 young men from Iraq were fired. These men were started at 20 years old. There were 4 brothers and 1 brother's wife. They were in charge of the IT, right, for Congress and for the Intel Committee. And only when we just went into Yemen and the terrorists were waiting for us and they killed one of our special forces, did they begin an investigation. Now, when they begin an investigation like this, the 3 brothers were let go. The 1 brother and his wife are still working there. But they had access to the emails. They stole computers, access to the emails for the Intel Committee. So the top intelligence that was flowing through Congress and through the Intelligence Committee. And from what I'm told, when they find someone that's done this, if they find them in the process trying to get into computers or emails, then they fire them or arrest them at that point. But when they've actually gotten information, they don't arrest them because they don't want to let out that they did have access to the proper information.
That's scary.
So it's frightening. And the idea that we are so, well, if you think that Barack Obama was simply a president who was doing a bad job, that's one thing. But if you think he was passing out information against the country, that's another. Anyway, these men took computers. They were waiting for us when we got into Yemen. People were killed, and so that investigation is yet to take place.
So remember, enabling America's enemies takes more than one guy at the White House. It takes a strategic team that's placed in various agencies, each agency having its own role. So there has to be an understanding of who they're going to need where. And sometimes they move these players around like pieces on a chessboard. But for example, and we're going to get into it further as we tell you about Gulftainer and Port Canaveral, but it requires having people in place at the Treasury Department, at the Department of Homeland Security, at the Maritime Commission, and these different agencies so that a transfer of critical infrastructure can take place basically in the dead of night without the knowledge of Congress and the American people and be successfully transferred to foreign interests.
Well, that's a good segue into the next subject, and I guess I was going to suggest it'd be a good time to get into the centerpiece, really, of tonight's program, and that is your paper, What Could Possibly Go Wrong? The secret deal allows company tied to Saddam's nuclear bomb maker, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates to manage key Florida port facilities. That is an absolute mind-blowing paper that you guys prepared for the Center for Security Policy. I guess, would you please start with the basics of who, what, when, and where, and we'll get started on that subject because that is huge.
Well, let me start out a little bit about just telling you where Port Canaveral is and the role that it plays in the national defense. So I'm sure your audience is all very familiar with what used to be known as Cape Canaveral and then as Kennedy Space Center. It's on the east coast of Florida on the Atlantic Ocean, about halfway down the coast, about 50 miles east of Orlando. Now, this was an area that was developed in the 1960s during the Apollo space program. Of course, after Kennedy said that we need to go to the moon, things really picked up. But it's also more than just NASA and the space program. There is multiple Air Force facilities there. There's Patrick Air Force Base and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. And then the Air Force Station actually has another tenant inside the Air Force Station, which is Naval Station Port Canaveral, which is a facility for U.S. submarines that are equipped with the nuclear ballistic missiles, the Trident missiles, and they are moved. These boats move between Kings Bay, Georgia, which is the Atlantic fleet for the submarines, and they sometimes dock in Port Canaveral. So you've got space launch facilities here. Then also at Port Canaveral are multiple missile testing launch facilities, and most of the major ballistic missile programs of the Cold War were developed and tested at this test range, one of the key missile test ranges in North America. We're talking the Polaris missiles, the Minuteman missiles. So there's a long history of development of top secret technology there that continues. So Port Canaveral is more than, and by the way, the port itself is adjacent to Kennedy Space Center, maybe 10 miles away, and it's directly next door to Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, which is used to launch defense satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office, for the Central Intelligence Agency, Geospatial Agency, and also for private lifting of payloads for SpaceX. And I even believe that Blue Origin is now moving into that area as well, which is Jeff Bezos' Amazon. So private space industry, NASA programs, Air Force launches, naval submarines. Also, it's part of the Sea Lift Command, where these merchant marine vessels can load equipment, for example, to deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan, to bring Bradley fighting vehicles, to bring Abrams tanks, to bring Humvees, to send troops. This is a very key national security asset. On top of all that, you have the commercial side of the port, which the biggest one is the cruise ship industry. Port Canaveral is now the second busiest cruise ship port in the world, right behind Miami. There's major cruise lines there, Norwegian Cruise Lines, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Disney. And then they also want to develop their cargo container operations. And who did they give that capability to? We're going to get into that.
Okay, good. That's a great lead into what we're going to be talking about. At this point, folks, we need to take a very, very short break. Kelby, turn the program over to you, and then we'll be right back to flesh out this information.
Thank you, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you and welcome you to the Connecting the Dots with Dan Hampel. We hold these shows every week, Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific. We ask you to go to republicfortheunitedstates.org. We've been doing calls and shows for the last 6 years. We have a lot of information on from a lot of different people that Dan has talked about, and Dan's show for me has been my favorite. His guests are impeccable, and I look forward to them every week. Do check out the Wednesday night Building the States call. That's what we need to understand, is how to re-inhabit the original de jure, which is separate from all these corporations that are starting all over the country, about 180,000 of them, acting and operating as a public franchise known as your government. We can come back into the de jure, and the Wednesday night call teaches us. But again, we thank you, and we look forward to you coming on these shows week in and week out, and we'll see you next Thursday, just as we're recording tonight. Dan, I yield the floor.
Okay, thank you, Kelby. Mary, this is a good point to kind of flesh out the normal procedure for transferring control of critical infrastructure to foreign powers, and how that was eliminated in the transfer of Port Canaveral. And incidentally, I think our listeners could tell from Alan's discussion, this is an absolutely critical security a piece of the puzzle of the American security program. And in dealing this away, it literally is putting a cancer right in the heart of our security apparatus. So, Mary, would you like to explain how this whole process happened and how the normal procedure was completely ignored?
I would. Let me also first interject that Port Canaveral is not only our first line of defense, it's our last line of defense. It's where not only our nuclear submarines are reloaded, but also NATO's. And then there's the E-4B, the Boeing E-4B, which that's the plane that goes up with the President and the Secretary of Defense to manage a nuclear war. And one of those planes is always in the sky at one time or another. And to think that they put an enemy of the country in this port, and I don't say that lightly. He was decided when we went into Iraq to be an enemy of our state. So at the time that Port Canaveral was taking place, they did not tell the people of Florida. They did not have open bidding. So the deal with Florida laws was illegal. No one knew that this was taking place. No one was able to bid on it. The Sunshine Law says that you must tell the people as well. They were in secret negotiations for 2 years. Jack Lew, the Secretary of Treasury, flew over to the UAE, and within 1 week he was back, and there was a signing ceremony where they announced it and signed the deal all at one time. Now, when you're handling particularly critical infrastructure, you have to go through the CFIUS or the FINSA process, or the FINSA process. In this case, it should have been FINSA because as we were researching, we came upon the World Bank documents. And so as they provided some documentation, the documentation itself was fraudulent. So they did downstreaming where they created all these new companies and they put different percentage or different holdings, amounts of holdings, and so that you couldn't see what they actually were holding. So it shows below a 50% mark of ownership. And had they told the true amount of ownership, they would have had to have gone through a process where we looked at all of their holdings and who they were connected to. So they didn't give us that information. So to lie to the United States government in order to get hold of one of our ports. But then we discovered that the part of the royal family, the Royal Highness of Sharjah, was a partial owner of the company. That means that the Port Canaveral is actually owned by a foreign government, the UAE. Now that became particularly disturbing because the UAE were the same people that were shipping arms and financing the shipment of arms to Benghazi, where our people were killed.
I also wanted to just clarify when we discussed Port Canaveral and Gulftainer that the lease that they obtained gave them control not of the entire port, but of the container cargo terminal. But that's a very important part of the port, and it's located right in the middle of the port, next, very close to the submarines, very close to the cruise ships, very close to Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. But the overall port is still controlled by the Port Authority, but they've given control of the cargo operations to this Middle Eastern company.
I see. Okay. Well, one of the things that I think it's important for our listeners to understand, though, that this couldn't have been done without key people in the administration making sure that the normal vetting process, the normal screening procedures were eliminated or just completely glossed over.
And we have admissions on record from officials from Gulftainer, for example, Peter Richards, saying that this was done very quietly. This was very hush-hush because they knew that from the Dubai ports world, if your listeners recognized Dubai Ports World. That happened in 2006, where the UAE government owned Dubai Ports World, tried to take over multiple U.S. ports, and fortunately they were forced to back down from that when the public and Congress found out about it. So they knew going into this that they were going to have strategic people in various agencies, and that they were going to have to do this quietly, because they knew from the Dubai Ports World experience that the public needed to be kept in the dark.
Well, didn't the administration even codename this project Pelican? So it even had a code name.
It did, Project Pelican. But beyond that, they'd made a run at another port, Port Jacksonville, which is also a critical infrastructure where Kings Bay is, where our nuclear submarines are also there, and where our soldiers leave when they're going into the theater. And so Peter Richards, the same people, the same players were working in that deal, and including a woman named Corinne Brown, who's been indicted for other activities, but all the players were very close to the Clintons. And something leaked out, and what had taken place, so if you can imagine, they thought they were going to get Port Jacksonville, but somebody leaked that they were going to give the people at Port Jacksonville $250 million to be a silent partner to own that port, but no one would know who the actual ownership was going to. So Peter Richards had set that up with people at Port Jacksonville. And then when the information had leaked out that they were being paid $250 million to do this, then Paul Anderson, who had been the head of the port, put the kibosh on the deal, and it did not go through at the last minute. That made them get that much more stealth in going for Port Canaveral.
Well, that also is kind of tied in, isn't it, Mary and Alan, with this layering of spin-off subsidiaries and name changes that are employed by these people to make the trail of ownership so muddy that people can't really follow it?
Yeah, so they created a bunch of fraudulent companies. This is called downstreaming. And so as we tracked those down, they were incorporated on the same day in the same place, right before they did the deal and did the signing. So all those companies were fraudulent, as was all the documentation and the incorporation papers.
Wow, that's
so the actual business entity that signed the lease is called GTUSA. So for the general public that sees the word USA in the name of a company, right there, you can see the PR spin and creating the illusion, that this is something American. They put American flags on the gantry cranes, and it is a complex web of companies, and it's still not entirely transparent how many companies there are, but the parent company, as you eventually go up the chain, is Gulftainer Limited, and we found the World Bank document, which I think they weren't counting on us finding, that says there in plain English that Gulftainer Limited had two shareholders, Hamid Jafar, who happens to be the brother of Dr. Jafar Dhia Jafar, the nuclear physicist who is known as the father of Iraq's nuclear weapons program, and then the other owner is His Highness the Emir of Sharjah, which is an emirate in the UAE right next to Dubai.
That's an amazing connection. You guys have really done a terrific job of exposing the level of this stuff. Can you now kind of maybe give our listeners a little bit of explanation of the pay-for-play connections with the Clinton administration and how Bill and Hillary kind of figure into this whole process as well?
They're well intertwined through the whole process. Bill was going over and giving speeches. For one speech connected to the Jafars, to their foundation, he received $5.6 million. But at the same time, this is for a foundation. And so the foundation is connected to business-backed education, and it's called GEMS. In fact, for your listeners, anytime you see a foundation coming out of the Middle East, and certainly any foundation that's been connected to the Clintons, it requires a lot of research. But not only did Bill receive $5.6 million, but they raised $70 billion, that's with a B, $70 billion in promissory donations for the Clinton Foundation. Now, you can pretty much assume that that $70 billion was to be paid upon Hillary's election, and I can't even imagine what they were going to hand them.
Wow. That's
so
amazing.
Just to clarify kind of the big picture of what we're talking about here and how that wraps into the Clintons. But if I was to just boil it down into an elevator pitch of what this story is that you have the strategic port here in Port Canaveral, which is in Cape Canaveral, which is, the most historic hallowed ground for America's space program, where we launched Neil Armstrong to the moon and the rest of those guys. Americans died on the launch pad there. We lost 2 shuttles that were launched there. I mean, this is the heart of America's space program. And then it's also key Air Force and Navy facilities there. But this cargo container terminal was leased to this company called Gulftainer, which is through a complex web of companies based in the United Arab Emirates. But that the family that started Gulftainer and their parent company, Crescent, is an Iraqi family, the Jafar family. And the 2 key individuals in the first generation of that family is a pair of brothers, Hamid Jafar and his brother, Dr. Jafar Dhia Jafar. Hamid Jafar is known as an oil businessman. The company Crescent was under investigation by the Treasury Department and at least 3 congressional committees in 1993 as a suspected front company for Saddam Hussein. Dr. Jafar is well known, was a genius at uranium enrichment. He oversaw a massive nuclear weapons program for Saddam. Estimates are that there was 20,000 employees in this program, including scientists, technicians, and other workers, that they had dozens of facilities spread throughout Iraq that were conducting uranium enrichment, ballistic missile development. They wanted to be able to do everything in-house. Saddam wanted to be able to create the Arab bomb. Saddam saw himself as a leader for a whole pan-Arab movement that was in its DNA extremely anti-Semitic. Their archenemy they viewed as Israel, and probably secondly as the United States, even though Saddam did cooperate with the United States for a number of years. So if you were to pick a candidate to hand your port to, and remember, ports historically have in a very important military, naval, commerce role going all the way back to, Roman times. You don't give your ports away. But that's exactly what we did, and this would have probably been the worst folks to give it to. We've also connected the Jafars not only with Saddam's regime, with his super weapons program, but also with Iran and with Russia. Crescent has done a number of deals with they're connected to Putin and Putin's number 2, Igor Sechin, who was the head of Russia's state oil company, and was also, both of them were KGB people. Sechen's nickname was Darth Vader and the scariest man on earth.
Okay, Mary, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Dr. Jafar Dhia Jafar, he had created what they believe was the beach ball nuclear weapon. He spoke of getting it into the port of Haifa, but also getting it into Washington, D.C. He was not just a nuclear physicist, he was a spy. He went and he worked on magnets in Russia. He was at CERN for 4 years. The scientists at CERN said that he was a spy and he was looking to weaponize nuclear power. That at the same time, then it was found that he sent people into the United States. They received documentation from some military base on creating laser technology. He also sent spies with $30,000, and they bought a laser. They also went to Tennessee, where they looked up Robert Oppenheimer's work, and amazingly enough, that wasn't protected information, and he replicated that in pretty short order. He is, in fact, they say he is at least as brilliant as J. Robert Oppenheimer, but also A.Q. Khan from Pakistan. But A.Q. Khan was also working with Dr. Dhia Jafar. So he's working with the Arabs of the world. And when our people were in Iraq, he told them that this was, Alan, do you remember the exact quote? He was creating the Arab bomb, and this wasn't just this was not only to regain their pride, but it was to pay back a millennial-old.
Well, there's been, I can't remember which book it was. We researched through a lot of books, both books that you can see on Kindle, some that are out of print and you can only get in hard copy. But, there's one book that discussed third world countries having nuclear weapons, and they can be used to settle ancient scores, some of them millennial old scores, and that it can be used basically for mass genocide to wipe out who you consider to be your enemy. So nuclear weapons in the hands of countries like Iraq it's a disaster, and you don't ever want to get to that point, which of course leads to the bigger question: did Iraq have weapons of mass destruction? And after spending months and months studying the WMD programs in Iraq, I would lean toward agreeing with some reports that they may have actually had working nuclear weapons. That's still not entirely clear. I think there's much more that we don't know that's been buried for political reasons. Getting back to what she mentioned, the beach ball, there's a book called, I think, The Baghdad Sun. There were multiple nuclear programs going on. When Saddam said that he wanted to have nuclear capability, especially he really ramped up his program after 1981 when Israel bombed several of his reactors, which, by the way, Dr. Jafar had set up. Those were supplied by the French. He had a lot of help from the Soviet Union and also from France. But they had multiple programs going on. Dr. Jafar worked on one called PC-3, Petrochemical 3. That code name was chosen to deceive Western intelligence to make it appear that this was some sort of energy program, oil program for civilian use. There are reports that there was more parallel programs, possibly a PC-4 and a PC-5. The Baghdad Sun book does mention that they may have developed a small tactical nuclear weapon called the beach ball. I don't know for sure that was necessarily Dr. Jafar's program, and we've looked for more confirmation of it, and that may have just been a mock-up of the beach ball, but there was a report that they did have something on the table to possibly use a nuclear weapon outside of Kuwait City, possibly during the Gulf War, and perhaps he used one, like she mentioned, the book mentions the Haifa Bay, which is a big Navy base for Israel. And so, I think we need to take very seriously that they were very close to having a workable nuclear weapon. Whether or not they actually got there or not, we're not sure. It's possible there may have been tests. And we can't dismiss the fact that they may have continued to develop their capabilities. Just because we invaded twice doesn't mean that the program ever completely went away. They were very meticulous in making sure that they had plans in place that if, for example, the United States and coalition forces got into Iraq, that they could hide their programs, move stuff, bury stuff, move it to Syria, put stuff on optical discs for later use, that they could reconstruct the program, and that's a big concern. What's going on today?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, in fact, one of the most concerning things was when Dr. Jafar was debriefed by David Kay, the UN weapons inspector, he wouldn't really talk and he wouldn't give them any information. And then at one point, he sat down and didn't say a word, and he drew for hours and drew every bit of J. Robert Oppenheimer's plans on how to build a nuclear weapon. And then he turned and he looked at Kay and he said, you can bomb our buildings, you can destroy our technology, but you cannot take it out of our heads. We now have the capability. And then he got up and walked out. So it was pretty clear he knew exactly how to make those bombs. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing is, at one point when we were going into Iraq, we bombed one building. And it was, as they were dropping their payload, they had one bomb left. And they thought they just dropped it on a building. And what happened when they did was, it was an enormous explosion, well beyond anything that it should have been. So at that point, they realized that they'd hit something that was beneath the building. So then they found that they were putting buildings and basements on top of underground buildings. So they've been very clever. They are very clever.
Sure.
Now the enrichment technology that Dr. Jafar exploited is something called electromagnetic isotope separation. This was the one, we had two different technologies that were used in World War II during the Manhattan Project. They used different types of nuclear weapons against Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But one of those methods was the electromagnetic isotope separation, which, to break it down, basically involves giant magnets that they then are able to separate the two different isotopes of uranium to get the highly enriched uranium isotope that they need for weapons-grade material to put in the nuclear bombs. So that was considered old technology for the 1940s. Dr. Jafar got his hands on basically the blueprints for this from the U.S. government, partly through port policy decisions on classifying or declassifying information, partly by sending his own agents into the U.S. to obtain information from the early internet, which was called ARPANET, and also experimenting with other technologies. But they really worked with this separation technology using what's called a calutron. Dr. Jafar improved that magnetic system with what became known as the Baghdadtron, and that was what he built in these massive underground facilities where they could separate the uranium. That required tremendous amounts of electricity. Now, there were audio tapes that were recovered by coalition forces after the 2000 Operation Iraqi Freedom invasion. Once they got these tapes, they learned a lot more about what Saddam Hussein talked about in his cabinet-level meetings, which Dr. Jafar was there for a lot of those meetings. And we've listened to a presentation that was called, I think it was called the Intelligence It was called the Intelligence Summit, and that was held, I think, around Crystal City near the Pentagon. But they went over some of these tapes, and you can hear Saddam talking about the power plants and how they would have these power plants appear to be for civilian use, and then there would be something that you could see from our U.S. reconnaissance satellites. So when the CIA analysts looked at it, they say, okay, look, there's some power lines. It goes over to a village over there. You know, they're lighting up some houses. Nothing going on here. But then there would be more power lines that would go underground to these facilities where they were running these enrichment programs. What's really disturbing is that after Dr. Jafar went on the run from Baghdad during the invasion in 2003, and then went through several countries and eventually surrendered, was then interrogated by CIA, MI6, other agencies. What did he do? He went to his brother, Dr. Hamid Jafar, in the UAE. They set up a new company called URIC. I think it's called URIC Construction and Engineering, or Contracting and Engineering. And they went into the reconstruction business, which in this case meant building new power plants. And they put those power plants positioned next to Saddam's former military industrial facilities, including suspected nuclear military industrial facilities and possibly near underground enrichment facilities. Remember, this is after the U.S. invasion in 2003.
That's valuable information. Well, folks, I hate to say this, but we've reached the end of our program. But I would very, very briefly ask our listeners to please check out our website and look on the website for Republic News Network website. You will find the links to all these different documents in these papers. And the article, What Could Possibly Go Wrong, I absolutely, really absolutely think that the average person in this country, if they read it, they would be astounded with the level of complicity with the Obama administration in this port steal. So I guess Mary and Alan, very quickly, can you tell our listeners how they could possibly help to expose this scam, and what we can do as individuals to make sure that these federal positions and postings, that this thing doesn't happen again?
Well, in addition to going to your website and the Center for Security Policy, I also just want to invite your listeners to visit Mary's site, which is the AmericanReport.org, and our full report is over there, and it can also be viewed at 1776channel.com. That's 1776channel.com. We also did several articles at Breitbart. And then, Mary, do you want to maybe tell them a little bit about how they might want to reach out to their Congress people or other people?
We really hope that you people will reach out to their congressman. Call. This deal has to be walked back. It's very dangerous. There are certain people in Washington, D.C. that are aware of it. But beyond that, call Governor Scott of Florida. He can cancel this deal in a day. That deal broke all the Florida laws. They lied on the documentation. The deal should be canceled, and it should be canceled particularly while, our Department of Defense is at, loose ends with everything that's taking place in Washington, D.C.
Also, if you see anyone in the military, let them know about this too. They're very key, and this is really endangering our troops too. We've got active duty people at these facilities, and I think they need to know. They deserve to know.
Well, they do, and I want to thank you folks for being guests on our show tonight, and I specifically want to mention Paul Vallely, Major General Paul Vallely's role in helping to expose a lot of this information too. and he is also a true American patriot. With that, I guess at this point, I'll turn the program over to you, Kelby, and thank our listeners and ask that they return next week for our next week program.
Thank you,
Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude the weekly show, Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. Bye-bye.